Right, so I know we've got a couple of people that's still waiting to join, and we'll just give them 1 or 2 more minutes and then we'll begin. Right, so I think we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Women in Innovation Building Success webinar today. We're going to be exploring imposter syndrome. So I'm Siobhan Smith, Lead for Diversity and Inclusion at KTN, and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today, Lorna Clark and Mary Eli. Lorna and Mary are two of the coaches currently supporting our Women in Innovation programme. Lorna works with people who care about leading well and the impact that they have on their team, business and community. And Mary's focus is on business and personal change, helping her clients make change simple, manageable and as comfortable as possible. Both regularly work with people who are struggling with imposter syndrome and want to find ways to reduce the impact it is having on their lives. So as we go through today's webinar, if you've got any question during today's session, please pop them in the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end. Lorna and Mary may be posing some questions for you during the webinar, so please feel free to put these in the chat box. And we'll, so as I say, we'll be using the chat box for some sessions throughout. So I'll now hand over to Mary, who will kick off today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan, and welcome everyone. So we're delighted to have so many of you take the time to join us today. So this will be an interactive session exploring imposter syndrome, a subject that used to be very dear to my heart. So we'll be covering how it shows up and how we can manage it. So I suggest you have a pen and paper handy because it could come in useful. And as Siobhan said, if you're comfortable, please do share your experiences with us through the chat function. Just bear in mind that other people will be able to see your name and your comments. The webinar will be recorded and put onto YouTube, so we won't be using anyone's names, and the chat will be deleted before the webinar is made public. So no worries there. And as Siobhan said, there'll be time for questions at the end, but if you have any questions as we go through and want us to tackle them at the end, then please just put them in the Q&A function, and including any other questions on technical issues. And just to let you know, the full copy of the slides will be sent to you after the webinar, so you don't need to take photographs of your screen or anything. So I'd like to now introduce our host today, Lorna Clark. Lorna is an accredited leadership coach and facilitator who often works with people who are transitioning to leadership or entrepreneurship and the joys and challenges this can bring. She has over 17 years management and leadership experience in professional services, startups and not-for-profits. And today she works with remarkable people, from aspiring leaders to established CEOs who care about leading well and the impact they have on their team, business and community. She's an insightful and effective coach, described by her clients as warm, supportive and able to create a space that feels completely safe to look at difficult issues. And knowing her as I do, I would agree with them. So Lorna, over to you.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Siobhan and Mary, for such a warm introduction, and to all of you for joining us today. We're delighted that you're with us. So imposter syndrome is something which is incredibly common, and I regularly work with incredibly successful people who have a strong track record of success, but often struggle with imposter thoughts and feelings. And if I'm completely honest with you, I consider myself to be an imposter in recovery. My earliest memory of imposter syndrome is in my early career, where I had been given a significant promotion. And I believe that there simply was no one else to do the job. And it was only a matter of time before I would be found out. This fear of being found out drove me to overwork, to dig into perfectionist tendencies, and to closely scrutinise the work of my team. I remember a constant feeling of anxiety and worry that I simply wasn't good enough, doing a good enough job. It was a very lonely place to be. Through excessive hard work and over preparation for everything, the business unit I led excelled. But I rarely felt that I ever owned my success or the part that I played in it. Had I known then what I now know about imposter syndrome, I think it would have made a significant difference, both personally and professionally, to be able to navigate that promotion with much greater ease and enjoyment. So my aim today really is to provide some clarity on what imposter syndrome is, look at when and how it can show up for us and the toll that it can take, and to share some ideas on ways to manage it. It's a huge subject for us to cover within the time that we have available, so we will literally touch the surface. But I hope that if this is something that you're experiencing, that you leave today knowing that you're not alone. It's not terminal, and it is possible to unlearn some of the self-limiting thinking that feeds imposter syndrome. So in terms of what it is, it was first identified by Pauline Clance and Susan Ims over 40 years ago now in their research into highly successful women who, despite high achievement and accomplishment, did not feel an internal sense of success. In fact, they actually had a very strong belief that they were not intelligent and had managed to fool everyone who thought otherwise. So when we talk about imposter syndrome, we're talking about high achieving, successful, competent people who feel anything but. They believe that at any minute their true abilities will be uncovered and their perceived inadequacies will be exposed. There are many misconceptions about imposterism, and whilst it is closely associated with women, it's not gender bound, and men are equally as affected. Imposter sufferers rarely feel like frauds in every area of their life. So, for example, they're unlikely to feel fraudulent driving a car. It tends to show up when it's triggered in specific situations. So this may be at work, it may be in social situations or in parenting. And it's often triggered by change or from being in a highly critical environment. Technically, it's not actually a syndrome, as a syndrome remains constant over time. And when Pauline Clance first classified it, she classified it as the imposter phenomenon. So for most people, those imposter feelings will come and go. And it very much exists on a scale of intensity, which will be different for each of us. And that intensity may vary over time. So let's have a look at some of the defining features. And in Clance's work, she found that there were really 3 defining features of imposterism. One, this feeling that others have an inflated perception of their ability. So a tendency to think others see them as more competent than they really are. And also a tendency to view others more generously than we see ourselves. So this, we tend to compare our weaknesses with other people's strengths. Secondly, this fear that their true abilities will be found out. So this underlying fear of being found out to be a fake, phony imposter that they believe that they are. And thirdly, this persistent tendency to attribute successes to external factors. So really an inability to internalize their own successes. So often people will discount positive feedback or have a hard time accepting compliments. So common responses you may hear may be, I was lucky, my team did all the work, anybody could have done that, through to even hearing people say on promotion, there simply was nobody else to do the job, or they made a mistake. So whilst they externalize their successes, there is a high tendency to internalize mistakes, and people will often agonize over even the smallest mistakes or flaws in their work. So I heard somebody describe this beautifully, that successes are like Teflon, so we kind of push them away, whereas mistakes stick to us like Velcro. So these are 3 very high-level markers. And Pauline Clance actually has an imposter scale on her website, which you may want to explore after this session. But for now, we're going to run a poll and we're going to look at these 3 features. And how many of those do you identify with from 0, 1, 2, or 3? And we'll just wait for the results of that to come in. So just waiting for those results to come. So we can see that the majority of people are identifying with 2 or 3 of those defining features. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. And that's very much what's coming out through that poll is very similar to what we see across the board. So imposter syndrome is incredibly common, and in research by the psychologist Gail Matthews, she actually found that 70% of successful people that she surveyed said that they would feel some sense of imposter feelings or tendencies at some point in their life. And I really love this quote by Maya Angelou, writer and civil rights activist, because it reminds me that no matter how accomplished and successful someone appears, we simply never know what's going on for another person. And that's really the sad reality of imposter syndrome, is that it very much thrives in secrecy. We daren't admit how we feel for fear that we're going to be found out and expose our perceived inadequacies. And yet the reality is that so many people across our friendship circles, across our teams and our businesses are feeling exactly the same way. So I think it can be really helpful for us to look at, when does it show up? And it tends to show up for us in times of change, transition, or where there's a new challenge. So this could be taking on a new role, taking on greater responsibility, or perhaps working in an area that's unfamiliar, or taking on a higher profile project. And I'm sure that many of us have felt like this at some point, because it's very normal at these times to not know everything and to feel that simply we have to learn as we go. It can also be triggered by being in a highly critical environment where mistakes are not tolerated, or they're met with disapproval, as this really ramps up anxiety around making mistakes and failing and ultimately being found out. And then we have intensifiers that can intensify feelings of imposter syndrome. So that may be a sense of isolation or feeling that we don't belong in some way. And that could be related to gender, education, to wealth, to race, to even regional background, for example. And another intensifier is around external stress. So that could be a lack of support at home, within the family. We may be experiencing health issues. And what I think is interesting is for us to think about, given the pace of change that happens within business, and often that we're operating within a fail fast, learn fast culture, that actually those things are really likely to ramp up and press the buttons if you experience imposter syndrome. So given all of that, what can we actually do about it? So the first point in being able to change anything is for us to start to be aware of what's going on. So we can use this imposter cycle, and this is an example, to get to know our imposter response better. So what triggers us? What do we say to ourselves? What do we think? You know, how do we feel? And what do we do? And from this, we can start to find ways to challenge what's going on. So this is an example, but as we go through the example, I would really encourage you to think about what resonates for you and to make a note of that and to think about what your cycle looks like. So Mary has very kindly allowed me to use her as an example for this from earlier in her career. So it will come as no surprise that Mary is a highly accomplished and competent person with a really strong track record of achievement and success. So the cycle starts with an invitation. So Mary is invited by her manager to lead on a new project. And her first reaction may be that she's simply not qualified to be able to do that project, or there are others who are more competent, and she may think that she wants to decline and not take up that. But let's assume that she decides to accept. And whilst her immediate response may be delight that she's been asked, this is often really short-lived as the fear kicks in that she thinks that she's going to be found out. She starts to compare herself with others who she thinks could run the project better, and she may focus on what's going wrong as opposed to all the things that are going right. She starts to experience a lot of self-defeating and negative thoughts, and yet she keeps how she's feeling a secret and doesn't talk about this because she doesn't want to draw attention to her perceived inadequacies. In an effort to be able to get through the project, she will employ a number of unhelpful coping strategies to avoid the perceived shame and humiliation being discovered and relieve some of the stress of feeling like a fraud. And whilst these are not conscious, they are likely to feel very familiar to Mary. And those typical but unhelpful coping strategies may look like this. So we know in Mary's case that actually she has a predisposition for over-preparing and hard work, and also perfectionism. So in the fear that Mary's inadequacy will be discovered, she works incredibly hard to prevent any mistakes from being made and over-prepares everything. So this results in long hours, often workaholic tendencies, over-preparing where enough is simply never enough. Overwork is linked closely with perfectionism, which is driven by a fear of failure and scrutiny. So Mary sets extremely high expectations for herself and also for her team, working hard to avoid any mistakes at any cost. So this could show up in terms of her checking her work to extremes and constantly refining and revising that work. And it could also show up in terms of how she's managing her team, in terms of continually checking and refining their work, or even choosing not to delegate to them in the first instance for fear of them making mistakes, or simply not believing that their work will be up to standard. So there are a range of other strategies there that she may employ. She may turn to procrastination in terms of focusing on less important tasks rather than the central tasks that need to be done, and then go right up against the wire in terms of the night before the project deadline, in terms of working through the night in order to complete. So as Mary is genuinely a high achieving and competent person, the project will often go well. And yet she will think that she's fooled everyone and that she's got lucky. Conversely, if she receives negative feedback, she has an internal excuse or almost a get out that it was a rushed job, so it comes not as criticism of her true abilities. Other strategies that people may utilise are around hiding out, avoiding or low profile, which are all strategies used to avoid situations where any perceived criticism or scrutiny is likely to happen. And this can result in people not putting themselves forward for new challenges or opportunities, not speaking up in meetings, or avoiding situations where they may experience feelings of inadequacy. It may also look like not finishing, which serves to keep a person safe from putting themselves out there where they perceive that they will be exposed. So this could be deciding not to take a product to market, or it could be about putting off launching a new business. And then other unhelpful coping strategies that people may go to may include self-handicapping. So these are strategies that really diminish capacity, impede performance, and create an internal excuse, so it's not a criticism of their true abilities. So they may show up late or unprepared for an important meeting, or they may stay up very late the night before an important presentation and have one too many glasses of wine. So with that in mind, I'm curious to know what may be your go-to strategy or strategies, or if there is anything that isn't on the list that you choose to employ. And if you're able to share your thoughts with us through chat, that would be great.
So even as you were going through the slide, Lorna, people were kind of resonating with some of those things. And I think from my own experience, I can pretty much say that I've used all of those at some stage or other in my life, but it'd be interesting to see what other people are using. We've definitely had procrastination's rung a bell with quite a few people. The perfectionism is definitely coming out as a favourite, and also the not finishing. So yes, definitely over preparing, overwork, perfectionism, procrastination. Yeah, hiding out. They're all showing up in here. So yeah.
Thank you. This is, yeah, as I would expect. My personal favourites are the first two: over preparing and hard work, and perfectionism. Yeah, they really resonate. So, you know, coping strategies in themselves is a huge area for us to cover. And whilst it would be fair to say that some of these strategies do actually pay off, they often lead to greater accomplishment, success, and sometimes even promotion. The reality is that they come at a significant cost, often to our health, our emotional state, to our work performance, and even into our relationships. People with imposter syndrome often experience high bouts of anxiety and stress, which increases the risk of burnout. And because imposter syndrome is ingrained and familiar, it can be really difficult to see another way. But we do all have a choice. And if this is an area of concern, it can be really valuable to work with a professional to unpack these and find a way forward that doesn't carry such a heavy price. So if we just pop back into the cycle, so that's the effort and work and the unhelpful coping strategies that we may utilise. By the time Mary gets to the completion of the project, she just has an overwhelming sense of relief that the project is over. She's hit, you know, the project deadline to time and to budget, but rather than being able to enjoy that sense of accomplishment and success that goes with doing a job well, she literally just feels a sense of relief. And even though the project has gone in, she still has a sense that perhaps she's going to be uncovered. So perhaps a mistake is going to be found in the report, that she's missed something, and that somehow her perceived ineptness will be found out. And then the feedback comes, and no big surprise, the feedback is excellent. However, she will diminish or discount this by saying things like, it wasn't me, it was my team, anyone could have done that, it was nothing special. And any developmental feedback that may come may be taken as a criticism and really agonised over and internalised. And so it is this inability to internalize her successes that means for each new project or challenge that comes, the cycle can start again. So given what we've covered so far, I would love to know what insights that you've gained on your own imposter cycle. And I'm curious to know what it's costing you in your life and what difference it would make to you if that was all gone. So if you could just take a minute to think about what reflections you have on those questions, and if you're happy to share them with us in chat.
Okay, so we have a few comments coming through. So I think some insight into actually what's going on. So realizing that you're not accepting praise. Feeling as though criticism leads me to believe I've really let my team down. So I think, you know, in terms of cost, it's really about how much time of your time it's robbing you of, and how it's leading to exhaustion, and how life would just be so much more relaxing if all of this stuff was gone. And actually also I like this one, say, you know, be able to take praise and then boldly accept a new task. So lots of excellent stuff coming through. You know, cost to my time and my confidence, another great comment. Yeah, lots of it's going quite fast. So yes, just wanting to be less fearful, and you know, the fact that it's actually preventing people from taking on greater responsibility and taking on more responsibility and actually missing opportunities, and just the stress it causes as well is coming through quite loud and clear from all this chat. So yeah,
great, thank you all for sharing so honestly in terms of your thoughts around that, and so that I get a real sense from a lot of the comments in there in terms of how much easier life may be without those imposter thoughts and feelings. And so what I'd like to share with you is some ideas around what we can do to manage those thoughts and feelings. And I'm sure that some may be easier than others. So see what works for you. So one of the things that is really important to do is to be able for us to create a new narrative. So as we've touched on, whilst other people see you as high achieving, successful and competent, with imposter syndrome, you know, we don't see it and we certainly don't feel it. So in essence, with imposter syndrome, we hold an inaccurate view of ourselves, but this seems very real as we're fully bought into what our imposter thoughts tell us, and we allow them to overly direct our actions and choices. So one of the things we can do is challenge that imposter narrative. So by challenging our habitual ways of thinking, we can develop a more accurate perspective of ourselves. And this is important because what we say to ourselves strengthens our habitual ways of thinking and being. So if we tell ourselves we're capable enough, regularly enough, we start to believe it. So one way we can do this is by building up the evidence of what is fact. So clients can find it really helpful to look back at their accomplishments, their achievements, and their successes that they're most proud of, whether they are small or large, personal or professional, and looked at through a lens that is without judgment and without the compulsion to explain this away. So we can start to look at this now. So I'd like you to take a moment to think about this question. So if you were to look back on your life and all your accomplishments, achievements, and successes, What are you most proud of? And again, thinking about things which may be small or large, personal or professional, you know, based on evidence, hard evidence, that encourages you to think about what strengths and skills you may have utilised to have made that possible, as well as any positive feedback that you've received. Resisting this compulsion to explain it away, or the fact that you were just doing your job, or to resist the temptation to judge it in any way. And if that feels difficult, it may be easier to look at it through the lens of somebody else who's looking in on your life. So imagining if someone was looking in on your life and all you have achieved and accomplished, what would they think that you're most proud of? And if you would like to, we'd love to hear your thoughts through the chat function again.
Okay, so we've got some things coming through, and I think, you know, all of these are absolutely valid and help us actually recognise what we can do and help us build our self-belief. So we've got, you know, bringing up 2 children on my own and supporting them through uni, getting through the first year of my firstborn, starting my own business in my late 20s, raised 2 kind, compassionate and caring daughters. I think it's really easy to discount a lot of the stuff that we do, and you know, it's a good exercise to go through and have a look. Giving up a job that I felt wasn't growing, I wasn't growing in anymore, and moving to Ecuador to fulfill a dream. Crikey, that's a big one. Wow. Yeah, not giving up. Actually, I mean, that's a great thing to be proud of, and just, you know, just keeping going. Courage to go back to school, achieving my dream job. Some great ones in here. You're all awesome. Proud that I keep putting myself on the line. Patient learner, listener, doing a PhD. All sorts of amazing things in here. Raising over 200,000 for a charity I worked for.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah, so great stuff to share. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. This is a really great exercise to continue to build on. I know we've been really super short on time, but I would really encourage you to set aside an amount of uninterrupted time to be able to build on this. You know, some clients really like to have a dedicated journal so that they can capture all of this in one place. So that they can then refer to that on a regular basis, making sure that they're reading it often to help them to be able to internalize more their successes and their accomplishments. It's also really handy in terms of having it centralized, that you have it somewhere that you can easily get your hands on. So in that imposter moment, you're able to quickly refer to it. And as Mary and I were talking earlier in the week, she had this really lovely analogy of saying it's a bit like having an EpiPen that you can go to in that moment of that moment that those imposter thoughts and feelings start to arise. And I think the important thing about this, creating this new narrative, really is to make sure that we keep adding to it. So it becomes an intentional practice and a growing body of evidence that we use in terms of really creating a new narrative around who we are and what we're about. So in terms of building on that, as part of creating that new narrative and being able to internalize our own accomplishments, practicing asking for and accepting feedback is also really, really valuable. So others often see us very differently to how we see ourselves, and their feedback from people that we respect and trust can really help us take a much more rounded view of ourselves. So some practices that it could be helpful to try out is actively asking people who you respect and trust for their feedback. So given that often with imposter syndrome, we have a high sensitivity to criticism and judgment, some people can find it really difficult to ask for feedback. So I think as a first step, finding people that you respect and trust is really important. And then simply keep a record of all the positive feedback that you have about your competence. And if you find yourself struggling to accept this, to set aside some time to examine the ways that you keep yourself from accepting this. And then you can simply experiment with doing the opposite. So having asked someone you trust for feedback, listen to what they have to say, really consciously take in the positive response and to try and take as much nourishment from that as possible. And my personal favourite is practice just saying thank you. So resisting the temptation to say anything other than thank you. So stopping any of those justifications that cause us to Teflon away that praise or any compliments and to push it away, even if that feels uncomfortable for us. And then much in the same way as what we talked about previously, to be able to refer to that feedback often and read it often, and to be able to keep adding to it. And again, many clients find it helpful to be able to centralize this so they have a go-to that they can refer to in those moments when those imposter thoughts and feelings strike. So a question to think about that you don't need to share with us on chat, but really to think about is, who do you respect and trust that you could ask for feedback from? And when will you ask them for that? So one of the things that I have found immensely helpful in terms of being able to deal with imposter thoughts and feelings is really around developing a greater sense of self-compassion. How we drive ourselves through imposter thoughts and behaviours is often harsh, highly critical and relentless, and can be loaded with self-judgment. So as I said, I found developing a greater sense of self-compassion important in terms of starting to combat that cycle of endless self-defeating thoughts and behaviours, and also to be able to support the creation of that new narrative. So we know from neuroscience that empathy for ourselves is not something that comes naturally to us, but it can be cultivated through regular practice. So I'm conscious that self-compassion is often something that can be seen as self-indulgent, or it's all about candlelit baths. But the reality is that there is a huge body of research that substantiates that it builds resilience and well-being in the face of challenging circumstances. So one of the ways that we can look at that is imagining a friend who's having the same imposter thoughts and feelings as you have experienced, and then taking some time to think about, what would I say to them in that same situation? And actually, if you have children, thinking about what you would say to them. So we're going to take a minute to imagine just that, to imagine those times that you are having those imposter thoughts and feelings, and to think about, if a friend was in the same situation, what would you choose to say to them? And again, if you're happy to share that with us on chat, we'd love to hear your freshest thoughts.
Thanks, Lorna. So we just take a minute just to see. I think somebody's actually said here, I'd never talk to a friend the way I talk to myself, which is a classic. And actually discounting the feedback from friends, which I think is is part of being an imposter. So it's letting that in actually. So we've got you're doing just fine. They chose you to do this job because they believe in you, and know you'll do a great job. It's a great one. Yeah, whose voice is your imposter? So sometimes it's a critical parent or teacher that stays with us. Yeah.
True.
And I would tell them that they're putting their effort into what they're doing, and that's definitely not being an imposter, despite any final result. So, yeah. And I think, somebody's saying this bit's hard, actually, developing self-compassion, just as you said, actually, it's not something that comes naturally to us. But with repetition, we can get there. So, somebody else here saying, I always tell people to believe in themselves and they can achieve anything they put their mind to. Be brave and they can do it. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. You do. This was a good one. Focus on the task or the people you're working for that motivate you, not yourself and wasting time on criticism.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. There's some really uplifting and inspiring thoughts there. So I think, these responses as kind of what came across on chat, it's we can use these in times that we are starting to experience imposter thoughts and feelings, or if we find ourselves in unhelpful coping strategies, they can be a really helpful leveler for us to return to. And as somebody said, it's hard to think from this place, and I would agree. But I think with like anything, with sufficient practice, it becomes easier with time. So, a few final thoughts around comparison. So, as we know, with imposter syndrome, we tend to compare ourselves really unfavorably to others. We tend to look at our weaknesses in light of other people's strengths. So comparing our insides and what's going on for us in terms of with other people's outsides. And it's very easy for us to think that everybody else is more competent and capable. And it's hard to believe often that anybody else is feeling any of the doubt and conflict that perhaps we are. But the reality is that this constant comparison results in a high level of self-criticism that only serves to reinforce our imposter thoughts and feelings. Comparing ourselves is not a kind practice. So if we can become more conscious about when we're doing it, we can make a more conscious choice to just stop it. And I find this quote from Roosevelt a really helpful reminder about how comparison just steals the joy for me and stops me appreciating my own accomplishments. So we know that imposter syndrome is incredibly common, affecting at least 70% of people who are highly successful. And yet we often feel like we're the only person who feels like this. And these feelings are really perpetuated by the fact that we keep our feelings a secret, because we fear that if we speak out, that we will be found out. And yet the reality is that many of our colleagues, our friends, and people across our organisations feel exactly the same way. So my question is, if you knew that everybody in the room had the same insecurity, how would that change your outlook? Just taking a minute to think about that. And again, if you're happy to share your thinking with us on chat, we would really appreciate that.
Okay. Just, there's a lot of great chat going on. Yeah. Yeah, I know that from my own experience, I think when you realise that everyone else is feeling the same way, it's very easy to be more self-compassionate. Actually, I think that's the thing that I take from it, definitely. So coming through on chat, yeah, I'd probably just be more vocal about my insecurities and offer my feelings to the room. Yeah, it breaks down the barriers knowing that other people have it actually. I'd be more open so that I can support those who are feeling the same way. I'd feel more drawn to them and feel like I could help them. I would. I think that's, you know, that compassion is coming out. I feel better about being more open and speaking truth more. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I would think that this is a phenomenon caused by our environment, not something essential about my ability. I think is quite key.
Interesting.
There's a lot about being supportive and helping others that, you know, that are possibly being as hard on themselves as we are. It would lower my stress level, feel more confident in who I am and who they are, less judgmental. Yeah, sharing my insecurities. Yeah.
Lovely. So there's a lot there around sharing, and I think, you know, the reality is we do, you know, we never truly know what's going on for anybody else, and it really makes me think about the prevalence of this and what our responsibility is if we're leading teams. Because actually, if you're a leader, how do you create an environment in which people feel truly safe to speak about how they're feeling, and where they feel that it's safe for them to make mistakes and where they can learn from their mistakes? And I wonder if you're in that position, would be willing to start sharing the challenges that you're experiencing to make it okay for your team to be able to share theirs. So as we start to come to the end, please do share any questions that you have in the Q&A function. But in terms of bringing today to a close, I hope you have a sense in terms of how common imposter syndrome is for high achieving and successful people. And whilst the fear of being found out can really drive patterns of behaviour that often lead to greater accomplishment, success, and sometimes even promotion, they are deeply uncomfortable and come at a really high price, both professionally and personally. Imposter syndrome is something which is learnt, and there are actually a great many things that we can do to identify when it comes into play, to be able to challenge it and to create a much more accurate narrative about ourselves. As I said at the beginning, it very much exists on a scale of intensity that is different for each of us. And if you're struggling to make changes, it may be helpful to work with someone who is qualified to explore where the beliefs and assumptions that underpin imposterism come from and help to unpick unhelpful behaviours. So we have literally touched the surface today, but I do hope that it's been helpful. And thank you for being with Mary and I and engaging so fully throughout. So I'm really happy to answer any questions that are coming through. And then once we've done that, we'll look for some final feedback before we bring today to a close. So thank you.
So a huge thank you to Lorna for sharing your experience and insights with us today. I think actually learning what it is and how it shows up is hugely valuable in itself, as well as the tips to start managing it. So yes, what questions do you have? We've got a few coming up on the Q&A box. So yeah, I love this one here. So how do we create teams and working environments that help people feel less inadequate and feel more confident and positive?
It's a great question. I think there's so much that has been written in terms of the importance of psychological safety within teams and how we create environments in which people feel that they're able to make mistakes. And I think we have to be so cognizant in leadership positions and within organisations in terms of really making sure that how we do that is implicit as well as explicit. I'm sure many of us have worked within organisations whereby people say it's fine to fail, but actually there are raised eyebrows in meetings or things which are said which make you feel that it absolutely is not the case. Yeah.
Okay. Another one. How do you know when you've got over imposter syndrome?
That's a great question. I think we just know. I think we know ourselves well, and I think certainly from my perspective, I can always remember that underlying sense of anxiety and worry, which was there, that I had no idea that this was imposter syndrome at the time. I simply felt as if I was failing badly within my role and not up to standard. So I think we get better at being able to spot it and being able to challenge it, and so we start to notice when it's coming into play, and hopefully over time in terms of developing that stronger narrative, but also looking maybe at some of the beliefs that underpin it and being able to challenge those. We start to notice that this is not surfacing so often.
So I'm not sure we've got any time for any more questions. There was one that just said there's quite a few questions there, but do you suggest any other books, Lorna, that people could read to help overcome imposter syndrome?
Funny you should ask that. Here is one that I've got to hand. So I particularly like this book. I don't know how well you can see that. The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women by Valerie Young. That's a really comprehensive book in terms of dealing with imposter syndrome, and there's lots of exercises to work through there, so that I think is always a good starter. But if people have questions following this webinar, please just email Mary or myself. Our email addresses will be on the slides when they're circulated, so please do get in touch with us. So I think all that remains is for us to launch the final question.
So if everybody online would kindly head over to Mentimeter, so it's www.menti.com, use the code 1684697. They will remain on your screens throughout this small section. And we're going to ask you one little question, please. So what is your key takeaway from today's webinar? And if you can, feel free to type into that. So again, head over to menti.com and use code 1684697, because we'd love to know what your key takeaway from today's event was. We've got some answers coming in already. Some of them are very good, and commonalities on the not being alone. It's not just them. It's very common. And that you should practice self-compassion. Believe in yourself. Is there anything standing out to you, Lorna, or Mary?
Yeah, that real sense of just how common it is. It's not just me, and knowing that we're not alone with this. I think that's a huge part of just it. As I said, it thrives so much in secrecy. I love that. Accept the compliments, ask for feedback. Oh, that's lovely as well. Imposter syndrome is like a virus. Many people have it, but there is a cure. Exclamation mark. Absolutely, there is.
Brilliant. Right. So
thank you so much.
Close out the Menti now. And I'm just going to say a final few words. So I want to thank Mary and Lorna very much for the session today, and hope that everybody online has all now started the journey of being imposters in recovery, as Lorna said at the beginning. Thank you again to all of our wonderful coaches that's taken us through the last few sessions. If you'd like to reach out to any of them with questions or comments, please do feel free to contact them. We'll share the details when we share the recording afterwards. And we have our next Building Success webinar on the 28th of October, where Victoria and Nicola will be looking at resilience, so you can tune into that. And just before we all go, I want to say last thank you to everybody for joining us today and joining in the exercises, being very honest in the chat box. As I said, the recording and slides will be circulated afterwards. And they'll also feature on the Women in Innovation webpage, so do please feel free to head over there. I should mention that you can keep up to date with Women in Innovation news and events by signing up to our newsletter or joining our online community on either World Labs or LinkedIn. And do feel free to reach out to me directly. So once again, thank you, Mary and Lorna, and everybody that joined us today. Thank you.